What's going on, everybody? This is the FinTech Flo on the go, is what I'm calling it. Stefan, great to have you subbing in here for Mike.
Of course, happy to be here.
So I see you don't have your red cover to your mic anymore.
No, I just keep it for my nose when I'm acting like a clown at work now.
Did you know that was actually one of the clients of mine? I had that. It was that whole organization that was trying to get people to. I can't recall the name now off the top of my head. But where everybody would have the noses, you'd get them at, I think, like Walgreens or CVS.
Was it a very large organization? I kind of wonder what their annual revenues were.
It was a not-for-profit, of course.
Okay, fair enough. Interesting. That's an interesting, there's a lot of businesses out there I don't think we ever think about, right? We're you just kind of buy the product and you don't think about who's really making the decision behind this? Who's really wants to pursue this marketplace?
I think that actually, now that it's coming to me, I think it's a Comedic Relief is the name of the company, and it was supposed to be to help encourage fundraising and awareness for I think sick children and stuff like that, but by making people laugh, which is
I love it.
Kind of what I'm down here in Texas doing, actually. So for those who don't know, the reason this is remote is for a couple of reasons. One, we have a podcast studio that's in the process of being built in Los Angeles. Two, Stefan's in Salt Lake City and hasn't invited me to come do a podcast at his place yet. And three, I'm in Texas speaking at the Texas CPA Society, Fort Worth, and it's my first time to Texas.
Oh, really? How's Fort Worth treating you? How's Dallas treating you?
So we landed in Dallas, and that was, your city-esque type of vibe. I always kind of describe cities as like miniature New York. So I was like, oh, it's like this part of New York, or it's like, oh, it's like that part of New York. It kind of felt like, it was your outskirts downtown. Maybe it was like a Soho area of New York or a Murray Hill type of feeling to it. Fort Worth, though, get this. I got my little intro story for you is, we got picked up in the Uber to go from Dallas to Fort Worth, and people were telling us that Fort Worth is a lot more traditional Texas than Dallas is. Our Uber driver actually was a country singer, naturally, and he had just picked up 4 fresh chickens, and they were in the front seat of the Uber chirping away as we were on our 30-minute ride.
Like little chicks, or were they full grown adult chickens?
Little chicks. Apparently, it's the end of whatever the season for chickens is, and so he was able to pick up a couple at a discount price, and he said, "I'm going to go bring them back and make some eggs."
Oh, there you go. All right. I don't know if I didn't realize there were seasons around chickens hatching. I had neighbors growing up. I grew up in the countryside, so I had neighbors that had chickens all the time, and it was just well, no, that one got fertilized, so you actually now have a chick, instead of, somehow the rooster got in the pen. So, I didn't realize there was a season around it, but that's fun. Yeah, I think, my take on Texas is every part of Texas is trying to tell you that they're the real Texas. Yeah. And the other parts of Texas are highfalutin. And I really do love that characteristic about Texas. I just love the fact that they just really lean into the roots, and everybody's about leaning into the roots there. So I hope it was a good stay. I hope you got some good Tex-Mex while you're down there. Yeah, definitely, for sure. I had some of the best barbecue I ever had yesterday. I mean, I think I'm going to go back and just get that for every meal at this point. It's a place called Heim's. Bacon burnt ends. It's just absolutely phenomenal. But no, I mean, I think it's a good point. That's why I'm wearing my Lone Star shirt here. For those who are able to visually see this and not just listening on audio, I'm wearing a shirt with just single stars on it. That's my Texas shirt, right? And as you said, people in Texas, they believe themselves to be the Lone Star State. It could be its own country, which is why everyone thinks it's the real Texas. So I got a little joke to kick things off, since this is what I've been doing. Why did the banker move to Texas? Why?
Because the interest rates are almost as high as the temperature.
Fair enough.
It's been over 100 it's been over 100 degrees since we've been here, so I'm sweating.
Well, see, that's why I didn't invite you to Salt Lake. We've been hitting record high temperatures here. It's been over 100 degrees the last several days as well. So,
wow.
It's as much as we love to ski in the winter, I don't know how we get this hot in the summer. It's kind of a wild divergence, but we're a high plains desert, so oftentimes we actually get very similar weather to Texas in some weird ways.
I would not have suspected that.
Every time it happens to me, I don't expect it either. I'm like, what happened? What did I do to deserve this?
Yeah, well, before I sweat because I got to leave the AC off for the audio quality here. Let's get into the show. Let's get flowing.
Let's kick it off.
FinTech Flo.
All right, what's going on, everybody? This is the FinTech Flo on the go version. I'm Drew Carrick, co-host of the FinTech Flo podcast and producer at FloQast Studios. Currently on my way to becoming the rapping CPA yet again.
My name is Stefan Van Dijvendyk. I'm the guest speaker today. I'm filling in for Mike Whitmire, the legendary co-founder of FloQast. And yeah, I'm the accounting operations evangelist here at FloQast. I'm really just here to help change the paradigm, shift the paradigm of accounting. So thanks for having me, Drew.
Yeah, I feel like it'd be kind of cool to see like maybe a sketch of some sort about the accounting evangelist. It's like a movement. I'm thinking of like the religious evangelists that go into a new territory and like you're evangelizing the Midwest.
That's right. I am ordained, so I can baptize people into accounting. I don't know if a lot of people would be willing for that though. So
that would be a pretty fun. That's actually a really fun. I think we come up with the best sketch ideas when we're on this podcast because I think that would just be such a funny thing, like the accounting evangelist. We're gonna have a sketch for each. We'll have the producers note that down in the back end.
Maybe season 3 or season 4 of PBC. Mix it in there.
We'll keep evangelizing for it. Well, with that. I wanted to jump right in there to the FinTech 411. So I know you've got some updates. I've got some updates. So walk me through here. What's going on? I saw this article from Accounting Today. It said, "Forget the Great Resignation. We're in our big stay era." What's this all about?
Yeah, I thought this was really fascinating because we've talked a lot at FloQast, and I think even here on FinTech Flo before about the accounting job market, how it's really hard to find talent, recruit it, to retain it on your team. We've seen in several very public filings that companies have had material weaknesses and missed filing dates because they don't have the right accounting staff within the organization, which is really just a wild notion because I don't even think you saw a lot of that when SOX first came out in the early 2000s. People still figured out a way to file their financials and get everything done despite having a huge new requirement on the organization. So it's kind of wild that, people are now coming back. It's like, well, we think it's a big stay. A lot of people are staying around now. I think it's WTW, which is like an advisory and solutions company, surveyed quite a few employees, about 10,000 employees within medium and large private firms to determine, employee sentiment on several topics, one of which was how likely people are to stay in their roles. And that's what this article is really based on. And 72% of responders said they plan on staying in the roles, up from 53 in the prior year. They attribute a lot of this to employers focusing on ramping up pay and benefits kind of at the end of the pandemic to attract really core key talent. And the companies that really use these tactics are now seeing a strengthening to their core teams and seeing the payoff. What is interesting about this, they're not really stating this from fact. They're kind of just giving their perspective on it. But WTW and I think Accounting Today are kind of saying, well, it could be there's a lot of uncertainty in the market from inflation, right? We've been in a huge inflationary period for a couple of years. Interest rates, as you were saying, have skyrocketed to Texas high heat. And people might be looking for a little bit more job security, which, I think that makes sense. I think what's probably going on this year is, it's an election year. So regardless of political beliefs, in what way you vote or anything else, people tend to stay and be more cautious or conservative right during election years because they don't know, hey, if you have a change in the House or Congress, if you have an administration change, what's that's going to mean for the economy? My perspective is the economy keeps on marching regardless, and we'll keep innovating regardless. So I don't tend to be as conservative in election years, but the market tends to have that kind of sentiment. And so you're seeing that kind of play out within the marketplace.
I think that makes
Drew talking to other people, like, what are you hearing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense. It's just there's always nerves. I mean, people are always asking me, they're like, should I invest in this stock? Like my brothers were asking me about this, some friends, and people are kind of curious. Do they jump in on the market? Oh, I've got like $20,000. What should I do with it? And I was like, look, I mean, if it depends on your strategy. Are you looking for a long-term play? Or are you looking for a short-term play? But like you said, during election years, it always is. There's just a little more anxiety around it because it's uncertainty. You could see the stock totally shoot up and you're like, damn it, I should have been in before the election.
Yep.
Or you could so entirely plummet. And I think it's the same thing with the job market. I think you're also seeing this post-pandemic period where like people got like really job hoppy during that COVID period, especially with the inflation rates going up. It was the Great Resignation. You have this job hunt. Everybody's seeing the next greener grass, the next big opportunity, and they're trying to see themselves, take their salaries to the next level. But then you saw this tech cooling, which we've spoken about on the FinTech Flo here before, about a lot of these tech companies realizing that they're oversaturated with middle managers that aren't really accomplishing or doing a heck of a lot. And a lot of them are pretty much overpaid to not do a lot of work. And so you saw a lot of them fall off, and they can't find jobs that even will come close to competing what their salary was when they worked at that tech company. So I think there's just this notion of wanting to stay secure and at least, well, I know this is guaranteed. I like my lifestyle, how it is right now. I kind of don't want it to change yet. It's kind of embracing a little more of that accountant risk averse mindset, I would say, and the certainty of knowing your paycheck's coming soon and not putting yourself back out there on the market and taking the risk. And the interesting stat around that is, in June, the number of quits decreased, to 3.8 million, which is around 2.5%, respectively. And I think it just shows it's a cooling job market.
Yeah. I think it is in some degrees. I do think that you do see some cyclical tendencies in this. People tend to, I think during certain times of the year be more likely to leave than not. So, every quarter kind of has like a different economic expectation of what we expect to see within the job market. But I agree with you. I think there was a lot of activity. I think companies really invested a lot to chase after certain initiatives during the pandemic, when those initiatives were no longer needed or when they failed because they were just poorly planned from execution. Everybody that's on it gets let go. So you'll see a lot of these tech companies will lay off massive cohorts and then hire them back on within 3 months. And it's just this wild, I don't really understand it. I'm not in that position of like really like, seeing underneath what's the, behind the scenes of what's going on behind the curtain in these tech companies. But, it is a wild way to run your organization, and it's very different from like the way we used to run organizations, like even back in like the 90s and the 80s. And, it's kind of, I just think it's like a new normal within the marketplace. However, I will say this, the great stay period, I think doesn't apply to accounting. I think that, like when they did this 10,000, they didn't ask 10,000 accountants what they thought. I think it's still really hard to recruit and retain accountants. I don't think you would see the recent news within the last year's filings of people not having the right accounting staff to issue their financial statements on time, or having material weaknesses around having the right people internally to manage internal controls or financial reporting if people are staying around. So to me, I think it's really what it should tell business leaders and people listening is that you're probably going to hear some news suggesting that a lot of different departments are staying around. People maybe in marketing, maybe, sales teams are more likely to stick around, maybe other operational teams like your development teams. However, your accounting team is still very susceptible. So despite the fact that everything else may look healthy, don't take that for granted within your own team. Yeah. I think you and I have talked about this in the past. Like we did a survey here at FloQast on recruiting and retaining talent on accountants. The big difference between this study that WTW did and ours is what they're reporting at WTW is they asked people how likely are they to stay for the rest of the year, like this year one. And people said, pretty high, 72%. And that's great. But what about year two, right? So, okay, well, I'm going to stay out for this year. What am I going to do next year? Well, if I plan on leaving next year, or I am contemplating, the future of my role in this company, am I hitting a plateau on growth, whatever it is, if I leave in year two, you still have a continuity issue at your organization to be able to really, keep your team operating smoothly without interruption. And so if you have teams that are looking to leave maybe year two or year three, you still need to address that within the organization. When we did our study, we didn't ask just about year one. We said, how likely are you to leave within the next couple to few years? And we found that by and large, people were looking to leave their role within the next, 12 plus months. So maybe they might stick the year out, but they're not going to stick beyond that. And that was a little bit like, it wasn't as recent as WTW's, but this isn't even a year old of a study. And when we look at that data, people weren't just looking at leaving their employer like from an accounting perspective, they were looking at leaving the accounting profession. So again, I look at this and I say, what they're looking at is a great macro trend of what's going on within maybe the broader workspace. But anybody listening, you're here for the FinTech Flo, you're probably an accounting background, you're probably working in accounting. Do not take that for granted for your teams. Think out, make sure you look at your teams really tangibly and say, hey, are these people going to stay? Do I have continuity, or do I have a risk here that this person, that I might see them through the end of the year, but going into next year, they're going to start looking because, we're not going to give them a good raise, or we're going to hold back on benefits. You got to make sure to stay competitive.
And then how difficult it can be on an accounting team or in an audit when you have a turnover of employees and nobody has any idea what happened last year. I also always think about the cost of training up a new employee. I mean, you could spend 6 months training them, then they're a good worker for 6 months. And if they're already contemplating within that first year leaving, they're checking out for the entire second year because it's like, how much more am I going to invest in doing this? So it becomes a 2-year expense to have an employee for just 6 months, essentially, where they're actually fully useful and fully valuable.
Yep. I 100% agree. I think that investment period is like something we don't think about a lot of times.
Yeah. You can't just plug somebody in and be like, all right, get at it. There's always going to be that sort of apprenticeship aspect of it that you have to factor in. And I do think it is unique to the accounting profession and accounting roles, where I think some people during the Great Resignation, they were like, I'm done with doing this job that I don't like. I'm going to go find something that I really like. And I think the reason you have this big stay period, which the big stay, for those who are curious, the big stay refers to a trend where employees who had previously been part of the Great Resignation and Great Reshuffle begin to settle into their more permanent and long-term jobs from a full-time perspective on the long term. And I think a lot of people found those roles. And maybe they're not the best, but there's not really another option that's better. At this point, they did their reshuffle. They hopped off, they job hopped, and they found a nice perch to build their nest on. And I don't think many accountants have basically made that leap. Either they left the profession and they found something else, but those who are in it, like the profession hasn't done a good enough job of creating those good peers, those good benchmarks of like, here's the spot you wanted to get to, you hopped your way, you got there, and now you're ready to settle in. And I do think, like you said, it is very important. So on to the next one, which is the New York Times. This is an article about the fall of Kirschner, who was, I don't know if you heard about this case at all, but he was arrested on Valentine's Day of 2023, issuing charges of wire fraud after he allegedly had sent millions of dollars from the accounts of Slink, which is a software company that he had founded. And he basically was just taking, millions of dollars. I think at one point, $25 million of investor money into his personal account for personal use. He bought a Gulfstream jet for $16 million. And it always fascinates me about these situations. So he ended up getting sentenced, actually right here. I'm in Fort Worth. He got sentenced here in Fort Worth earlier this year, 20 years and $65 million in restitution, which is more than what he took. But obviously he's going to be in jail forever, right? So this guy's going to go hang out with Sam Bankman-Fried, right?
Yeah, they'll be bunk mates. Yeah.
Which I think would be funny to let's get maybe a video sketch of the white collar elite crime penitentiary, and they could be there's a comedy
what's
series.
their yard time look like? What are they doing in the yard? You're like, man, I just wish I'd taken a little bit more, or hey, I wish I'd just been a little bit more discreet. And it's like there is nothing discreet about what either of those individuals did.
It's absolutely insane. But what blows my mind, and I don't know what your perspective on this is so they talk about, rather than focusing on growing the fledgling business, he was funding his lavish lifestyle. I get that, right? That's the classic greed thing. It's using other people's money to fund your own lifestyle. But who are these investors that are getting swindled? Where is the checks? Who's reviewing the prospectus? Who's deciding, I'm going to give this guy $2 million? He's got to be reporting back financial statements, I would think, of how the company's doing. And if you see the financials aren't coming in too well, and this guy's talking about buying a soccer club or buying a soccer team, there's some sort of disconnect. And so is it that investors are they not thinking, oh, I just trust this guy, here's the money? Or like, I don't understand how you get swindled.
I think it depends on, I think there's a lot of factors to it, because I wonder the same thing a lot of times. We're just like, man, like how do you get, fleeced for $25 million? And if you look at a lot of companies, like that's a large round of funding for a new company, $25 million. So what were you running the organization on? Like, it's like they don't give you, it's like not all, I mean, like we just did a round of funding here at FloQast and we raised, $100 million. And it's kind of wild that like, we're a strong performing business. We do well. People are interested in investing in us. And that's what we, probably we could have taken more, I guess, if we really wanted it. But if you're looking at a brand new startup company, people don't want to invest, oftentimes a whole $25 million in you. So how did you even get that much money invested in the first place? Who was looking at the valuation of this, the shares they're buying, and saying, oh yeah, like it's I'm willing to put $5 million in it. But what is always interesting about investors is the actual investor is often not the person at the table, right? Mm. So it is not often, your uber rich individual, these wealthy families or these funds that are sitting at the table. It is a investment firm acting on their behalf. So a VC, a PE that has an investment kind of call from that investor that is investing on their behalf. So to me, I think what's really interesting about this is, whatever firms were really investing in him really didn't meet their fiduciary responsibility to their investors by allowing something like this to happen. That's just the long and short of it. Yeah. And, I think this is like goes back to the need of like, this is why you have accountants. This is why you make sure that you're getting audited financial statements back, why you're looking at them, why you're having these serious conversations and not dismissive of what the reporting's telling you. I think in this article that you sent, didn't it say that he was firing anybody that like questioned him, like that dared? It wasn't just like, oh, like a question on this in general. It was like any kind of, he set a tone where any kind of questioning that was done, it was like, hey, you're out of here. So really prevent any of this information going on. But then at the same time, he's acting and making these big moves where it's like, it's hard to hide a Gulf Stream. Yeah. Like it's hard to hide that in a hangar because that hangar's hard to hide. So I think, investors probably knew about this fairly quickly. But once the money's gone, your ability to claw it back is really limited, and your ability to gather information to claw it back can be really limited if he's careful about, who's at the company and who's sharing information. So, it wouldn't surprise me if they figured it out quickly, like at least the old kind of legacy investors. But by the time they could really act, it took them several years to try and claw back that money. Yeah.
Yeah, I think sometimes people too can get blinded by the golden egg. Right, it's just the reflection that comes off of it, and I know this from. This is why I'm curious as to who the investors were, and I'd have to do a little bit more digging to figure that out. But like, a lot of the times you'll see, I mean, it can be on an Instagram ad, like, "Hey, get in on this like hot growth, this fast growth AI startup company, founded by this guy." And if they got like one credential that they can kind of link onto and showcase, like, "Oh, I trust this guy. I'm gonna put my money there." That's how the rich get rich. Right? Like they get in early. They get in early on a guy who's just going to go make it happen. And, sign up, put in 5,000, 25,000. Was it a bunch of these basically unaccredited investors who are pooling together? I mean, that's still a lot of money to fundraise. But like you said, I think if you're questioning, it's like, hey, boss, we're not really hitting our sales numbers. I feel like we should use this money to do marketing. And he's like, no, I'm going to go buy a soccer club with it. And then you get fired the next day because they don't want you to start digging. I don't know. It's just all of it. I can understand how somebody could get swindled out of maybe a few $100,000, even a couple million. But at this scale, that's big dollars. And you'd think that people who are spending those types of big dollars are smart enough typically to know how to do that due diligence. You think the PE or the VC firms are smart enough to know, like, okay, let's make sure that we're doing the fiduciary responsibility. So definitely a flop there. And the thing that the final piece on this is like, it must have been, I would think, a legitimate business at some point. Yeah. Like he had to build some sort of software tech that he could then pitch out and show, oh, people are buying it. We just need some more money to invest in. I think with a lot of these, it's got to be R&D. It's like, oh no, we're investing a lot in R&D. And that R&D is literally his personal pocket, and there's no research actually happening. And it's like, no, it's going to take 5 to 10 years to see the developments of this technology that we're doing. But once it comes out, it's going to be huge. It's going to be like ChatGPT.
Yeah, I think there's 1,000 ways people try and skin that cat too. It's like, when people commit fraud, they get really creative. And just things I think most of us don't think about day to day. Like, it's like, I don't think most of us go around and think, how could I get an extra $1 million out of FloQast? Like, right. I'm just like, oh God, I'm worried about just submitting my expense reports on time. I'm not really worried about getting more money out of it. I was like, I'm just hoping to get back what I spent before I forget about it. And, I think there's a mindset thing there, but I think, it's like you'll see them where they create false vendors, right? So he could have said, oh, we're buying this company and, create a fake entity for them to buy, and they invested $60 million and, he takes it that way. It's really wild, and it goes back to, it's like the Friedman case with the blockchain, right? It's like, they didn't have proper controls in place, and so it was really easy for people to just take money from the organization because they didn't do checks and balances, they didn't have review, they didn't have segregation of duties. It could be very similar here, where he just had access to wire money, and it could be as simple as that. So it's always interesting when you see the actual mechanics behind it. I think. It just blows your mind on like how some of these things occur, right?
And these are such common sense accounting. Like, this is principles 101 controls. Yep. Like, segregation of duties is probably the first control that you learn about internal controls when it comes to
accounting. Probably learn it in your like intro to accounting class, right? They're like, okay, today we're talking about segregation of duties, and all of us like stare at them like, oh, what's that, right? Yeah. But it's like one of the first topics.
And I mean, I guess, and again, this is the play for, and again, I think this just organically comes up, and I love when it organically comes up. But the plug to the accounting profession is, when it comes to speaking the language of business and being able to write the operational playbook, which is, a thing that you talk about all the time. Obviously these people at the VCs maybe came from a different route and they never learned these basic principles. They just know how to throw around money into big investment situations. But Mike talks about this all the time. It's more important to build the balance sheet than to build the income statement. And if you want longevity of the company, that's critical. And I think a lot of these investors just see the income statement. They don't actually see the root behind it. Like you said, they don't see the mechanics that underlie it. And I think someone with an accounting mindset might be a better investor in that situation. Maybe they're not willing to take the risk on a company because they may be too risk adverse, but I think you got to combine them with somebody who has that maybe more risky nature. And then somewhere in the middle, you're able to meet where they say, I want to make an investment. This is a huge opportunity. Okay, well, let me at least check the underlying financials, the mechanics, the controls in place, make sure this is actually going to be a sound investment.
Yeah, and I think it's really hard for investors to really know what's going on from a control perspective, right? Because they're not having those type of audits done on the organization. Oftentimes these organizations couldn't support that type of audit in the first place. And I think that's why one of the, like AICPA still has you at least do a review of controls even for a non-ICFR opinion, right? Like, you still have to at least have an understanding of the controls of the entity from the audit perspective. But, it's really interesting. I think it goes back to like, what information are the investors really getting? Are they getting a simplified income statement? Are they getting a simplified balance sheet? Are they getting actual like detailed reports, and they're asking for management reporting? Because, in these private held companies, you should be able to get management reporting and really look into it. But, it is just kind of wild that he was able to take, $25 million. The other thing I think is wild is the fact that they want $65 million from him back. I don't know anything about this guy's background, but something tells me he doesn't have that extra 40, flush on him to like, hey, I'm going to sell the Gulfstream and all this other stuff and pay you guys back. It's like, I don't think he has that.
Yeah.
Like, even if he gave you all the shares of the company, something tells me the company will never be worth that unless you get someone in to run it, and they'll probably take a fair share. So It kind of seems like almost a, I'm spacing on the word, but it's like, it's meant to showcase what will happen if you do this type of fraud, but in the reality of like collecting it is zero.
Yeah, it's one of those the show pieces, right? It's when they need to make an example out of somebody, right? And so you show this is what happens. But that's a good sort of segue as far as the disclosures, as far as the transparency goes, right? With FASB, wanting companies to expand disclosure of labor and other expenses, and then companies will have to disclose spending on worker pay for the first time, which I think California actually started doing that more recently, where like they have to display what, if somebody asks, you have to tell them like the range of what they make.
Yeah, and I think you know what, I really like the image you pulled up for this. This is well done. If for those of you that are just listening, it says it has a FASB logo and it says exciting news from, and it says sort of but not really. And it really does encompass that. But I find this interesting. The FASB in June, end of June, I believe, unanimously voted to expand disclosures around operating selling expenses within the organization, or operating expenses within the organization, and have more disclosure around that. So the phase of the financials won't change. Your income statement or your statement of operations will still say, hey, this is your, selling and operating, or selling and marketing, however it's really broken out within your industry and your company. And here are your general administrative operating expenses that, are kind of before your non-operating items on your income statement. That stays the same. However, from a disclosure perspective, companies are going to actually have to, starting in 2027, disclose quite a bit more on the activity around the operating expenses. So for non-selling expenses, which that would be right now people really disclose on like advertising. You might have some disclosure on R&D that you have to have in the footnotes. It'll be just descriptive. It's not a table. It's not a required table or anything. And now what it's going to be is those plus other non-operating expenses, such as general expenses, will be put into a table into your footnotes of the financials to really disclose what's going on. That will include things like payroll and benefits and other expenses. And then you'll also have a separate table that you have to report on other selling expenses such as distribution, marketing. I even think probably like selling around that is probably going to have to be disclosed. I'm not really 100% on each one of those items. Might probably like products, anything that's along with products and service selling. And then you're going to have in your accounting disclosures, your first footnote of your financial statements, your policies, what your adoption is around that as well. So what does this mean? It means that investors wanted more insight, and the long and short of it is the FASB agreed. What I think is really great about this, to Drew's point, this is a great segue. Had more information been disclosed to the VCs that were investing, they probably could have caught this, right? They probably could have looked at this and said, well, it doesn't really make sense that you're saying you're spending this much on advertising. I haven't seen a single piece of advertising from the organization. Or it doesn't really make sense that you're spending this much on professional fees, if that not already disclosed, because we haven't approved any kind of large consulting fees. Or it doesn't really make sense that you're saying you've bought this other organization. We don't remember buying another organization as a board. So it just gives them a lot better insight into where that money movement is going. And it gives you better kind of insight on where that should be. You should maybe expect to see that on the statement of cash flows. So it just makes it a little bit easier to kind of tie everything together and validate what's going on in the financial statements. It's a better sniff test. So, a lot of companies have been pushing back against this. I think Starbucks pushed back against this really hard. I think Apple pushed against this really hard, not wanting to disclose what they're selling to, what they're spending on things. I think the long and short of it is more work. It's more audit fees. It's more administration and everything else. It's also just going to mean they have more to explain to investors, and they're going to have to justify potentially decisions that are maybe more apparent in those disclosures to investors, instead of being able to just talk about maybe high level strategic initiatives within the organization. So it's kind of tough. I feel for companies having to report on it, but at the same time, I understand why investors want to see it.
Yeah, I think some of it has to do with like the size of the entity, right? Like a company like Apple, they can afford to take that additional audit fee, I think, to make sure that this can happen. I think also it matters too, is like I do sympathize with companies from the standpoint of sometimes it's better to just keep things high level. And I'm somebody who tends to go into detail very elaborately. I write lengthy emails, I write lengthy Slack messages, I go the whole detail. I started doing this thing that John, our comms guy, had recommended. And I used to do this and I kind of got away from it, and he reminded me, like a TLDR at the top, which is just like, here's the point. If you want more context, there's a bunch of stuff underneath. If you don't have time to read it, don't read it. But like, here's the main thing. And I think that's how this needs to sort of be positioned, because I think the risk that companies are seeing is if you disclose something, that opens up something to interpretation that maybe if you had been able to not say anything about it in the first place, you wouldn't have to now explain it. But somebody they can interpret and say, oh, look how much they're spending on advertising. It's because they care more about and they compare that now to what the product development, expenses are. And they're like, oh, they're spending so much on advertising. They're not spending a lot on research. It's because they care more about fluffing up the look of the product than the actual product itself. And it's like, no, it's important to get it in front of people. Otherwise, it doesn't make money. And then it doesn't matter if you research a great product because nobody's aware that it exists. Right. And so there's the different things that like the lay investor might interpret it and take it in a bunch of different directions. You can imagine news companies getting their hands on this and twisting a disclosure and making an assumption about the way that the business is operated that really is not true. And now these companies are like, oh, great. Now I got to explain and re-explain and then take the counterpoint that they're making and defend against that, where it would have been nice if I just didn't have to say anything. Yep, we're investing in advertising. We're going to make sure it gets in front of people. Now we have to get into all the details. I'm curious about the whole disclosure on spending on worker pay, though, because I think that's a really interesting concept.
I think it is. I think it'll allow some companies, or some investors and just financial professionals to go in and kind of back into certain numbers. It's like, well, I can kind of see what your employee count is, your FTE. I can figure out how much you're paying in general, and then it kind of lets them set a baseline as far as like maybe what the industry expectation is on employee salaries, and it lets people kind of estimate, hey, do people get paid well or not at this organization? It'll let them know if hey, do they pay management really well here? Do they pay their employees really low here? And their frontline workers really low here. So I think it gives a lot more insight into what people are getting paid, which creates a fair amount of I think healthy competition within the marketplace. It forces companies to really own up and say, we got to pay you what the market's what the supply and demand of your position is really pushing here. And I think that's generally healthy for organizations. I think a lot of organizations look and they say, well, I'm spending too much on people, which, as we said, with tech cooling, to your point earlier, Drew, sometimes companies do spend too much on people because they hire for a lot of roles that are unnecessary. That's not usually the employee's fault. That usually happens to be with an initiative that was not executed against correctly. And so you just get useless people within the organization. Sure. It's not necessarily because that person doesn't do a good job or there's not value in the individual. It has more to do with the decision before that. The other, I think the other thing with it though is, the issue with that though is that, organizations do. So I guess I'll go back to this. Organizations that need to look to cut employees' costs to be profitable, really don't have a place in the market. If you can't make money off of what you need to pay people, you just don't have a viable product. If you can't control margins because you think you're paying people too much and that doesn't meet minimum wage or other kinds of, maybe like what the economic demands of that person's salary should be, sorry, you just don't have a viable product. And instead of blaming the employee and say they want too much money, you should look at your product and say, well, did I create a good one? Did I market it well? And everything else. So I've always had a bit of an issue with organizations that try to really save their income statement by controlling employee expenses. I feel like that has more to do with their ability to charge what they should for their product. So I think it does put the onus where it needs to be, but it could be on employee salary. It could be on what people spend on R&D, what people spend on advertising, what it really lets you get some baselines in your organization to compare what's going on in your marketplace, which I think could be really good for smaller organizations or kind of pre-public organizations like FloQast to really say, oh, well, this is what we think. We look at a couple high-performing tech companies in the same fintech stack. This is what they spend on employees. This is what they spend on R&D. It kind of gives us an expectation of where we should maybe be benchmarking or where we can maybe improve over others. And I think that can be really healthy for organizations to then march and track against. So I actually think for the broader marketplace, this will have really positive impacts in that regard.
Yeah, I think I'm always a fan of transparency. I feel like just the more disclosures, if it's feasible, of course, for that entity. But for the most part, we should be able to live in a more transparent world. I think it would create a better world. And I think obviously companies will have to deal with the pushback of if I see how much somebody else that's a peer of mine is making, but they should be able to justify that answer. And they say, okay, well, they're making that much because they do this, this, and that, and you only do these three things, or they made this big deal, and it forces accountability in a great way that I think. So I am
Yeah,
bullish. I am bullish. I think on that, which gives me a good segue into our next section, which is the bullish or
love it.
bearish section. Always a fun one. So I got a question for you to kind of lead off with that. Is like, what type of mattress do you have? Like, what size mattress? Where did you get it? What's the brand?
Ooh, oh man, the hard questions. How often do I look at my mattress? Well, I do change my sheets often, but I do have a mattress cover because I'm an adult. Um, I have I've had my mattress for a while now, but I have a king size
Okay,
because I like space. I like I like to have my space when I sleep,
sure.
and I also run really hot as an individual. Like I have a cooling pad on my mattress plus a window unit, so my bed is around 60 degrees, and my room is just above that. And I sleep in like with the thinnest of blankets on top of me, and I'm still like I'm a little warm right now. So it allows my fiance to then burrito herself in a very thick comforter to just survive the night next to me. So it's necessary. But yeah, I have a king size, and I want to say I know it's some kind of gel mattress, but honestly, I don't even remember who I bought it from. No
I mean,
idea.
did you get it at a store? Did you ship it?
Online,
Okay,
online. I did all online. They shipped it, and it was a great experience.
so apparently, though, the direct to consumer mattress market got like very inflated very quickly. Like Casper, I think, jumped on it early. There's the company
Hmm.
Purple. I think I have one Nectar, and so all these different ones. But for some reason, there's still all these mattress stores that exist, and apparently that's just because people are kind of moving back to like, actually, I kind of want to lay on this first and just feel it out before I
Yep.
actually invest in this whole thing. And it's not that they're crazy expensive, and it's super convenient to get it shipped to your door. It's in a box, you unroll it, you let it go, and you're like, oh, this is great. But it's also one of the easiest business models. Apparently, I didn't realize like it's all the same technology. All of the companies have the exact same technology. All they do is remarket it and in a different way, and it's the same thing as the other
Oh
one. But
yeah.
it's just so there has been a decline in direct to consumer mattresses, and with that happening, the bullish or bearish point I have here is on FTC mergers and acquisitions, because they've been pretty tough on mergers and acquisitions happening. JetBlue and
Yep.
the Spirit Airlines one got shot down, and then this one recently was that Temper Temper Sealy was trying to merge, where they were able to, I think, with Mattress Firm and become one. You know, basically, these guys make the mattresses, these guys sell the mattresses. Let's hop together. And
Vertical
unfortunately,
integration. Yep.
it got shot down. FTC said, nope, we're not letting that happen. This is too much of a monopoly. Meanwhile, it's only like 2.5%, like the biggest mattress. There's so many individual mattress sellers out there. This is another fascinating fact because that takes up so much space. And I don't know how you get into the business of selling mattresses, kind of like a car dealership. But you know, the mattress is it's something where I don't know how the FTC views what's the threshold for when this is not a merger or acquisition that's permissible. And I'm also curious if it actually is counterintuitive. Say two entities are looking to merge because it'll be mutually beneficial and they're both maybe struggling in a certain area. This will help us become a stronger entity. What if since now that they can't make this merger happen, you know, one of them goes out of business because of it, and then the other one has to buy up the other one anyway, or just they expand organically. Some of this I feel like is getting a little bit too tight by the FTC.
Yeah, I think it's tough to say. I think sometimes the FTC really tries to put like a hard line in the sand to make sure that people don't ever try to cross it. I remember that like T-Mobile and Sprint had a hard time merging back in the day. And you know, to be fair, I think some mergers are necessary so that companies can actually compete against the big dogs in the industry. So if you think about like JetBlue and what was it, Spirit? We're
Spirit.
trying,
Yep.
you know, you look at that and you're like, well, Delta's massive, United's massive, American's really large. They control most of the airway. You know, JetBlue, Alaskan, Spirit, like they're struggling to compete against these big dogs. So sometimes they have to they have to merge to compete against the larger organizations, and allowing them to do that, I think, is actually like better for you know, the market competition than not, right? Because it allows them to compete at a similar level, economies of scale. However, generally what we find out is when you do that, they just act like the other big dogs. They don't actually drive a lot more competition within the space. And so it actually is worse for the consumer. So there's theory and clinic, is what I like to look at, where it's like, you can have this theoretical, but once you put it into practice, it sometimes doesn't play out the way you think it will. And so I think the FTC really tries to like ride that line for that reason. Not an expert in this area, but I think it'd be better for the FTC to just break up large organizations and necessarily like spend their time blocking other ones from combining. So if you have, and they used to do that, like we had to do that in the telephone industry because that was one giant monopoly, and they had to come in and separate it, and they had to separate again because they found that regional monopolies were still monopolies, right? So. I think it's better to spend the time maybe breaking up ones that get too big than necessarily spend your time, preventing people from becoming there. But I think they just lose those battles, and so they try to prevent any more damage from happening. I don't really know much about this, but I will say, it is interesting that they really entered into the mattress market area, because I do feel like there's a lot of different organizations that sell. Like if you go online to buy direct D2C, there's so many companies that pop up and say, yeah, we sell our custom type of mattress. And I'm assuming they're different organizations. So it seems like it's a fairly segmented one, and it does seem like a wild move by the FTC at like initial blush. So
yeah,
I think I'm kind of, I guess I would say I'm bullish on the idea that these companies will probably push back against the FTC and could potentially win it if they decide to do so.
Yeah. I think moving forward, I think that's like a really cool philosophical concept of focus on breaking up the big guys as opposed to preventing the little guys from becoming the big guys. Because at least you give them a shot. The other ones have proven like, all right, we're not changing. Like we've got our position. We're pretty mattress firm here.
Nice. How long have you been saving that one?
That one just came to me.
I love it.
So just moving, keeping the show going here with the business philosophy, since that's what we're kind of dabbling into now. Reorganizations. We talked about this when you're talking about the layoffs and the business philosophy behind laying off, and we're in this new era now where I think the old companies used to be the slow growth model where you just gradually add on. Now we're in this crazy fluctuation where it's hire 2,000, fire 2,000, hire 2,000, and that could happen every other year. I think Tesla just fired like 1,000 employees. They're talking about how they're planning to hire another 1,000 after they just let go of a whole bunch. And then we had this interesting one from Intuit TurboTax, right, where it's the cost of letting people go versus the cost of keeping them around. And so TurboTax was planning to let go of 1,800 employees, but they also in their plan for the future is to invest in building back up another 1,800 employees. They're planning to like increase their headcount while they're laying off people. And I always think that's like an interesting communication from leadership, because they basically said, hey, we're going to invest in AI, and these people aren't really performing too well. So mass layoffs is interesting to me, because I think if it is an individual's on a performance plan, they get let go of. It happens.
Well, but that's also not a layoff. That's just a termination, right?
Sure.
Layoffs are where it's like, you're getting rid of people because you're restructuring the organization, and you're saying like, hey, this whole division isn't necessary, or this whole role type isn't necessary within the organization. And that is always really fascinating to me. I agree. It's like, you're like, what part of the company are you deciding that is no longer efficient and necessary for this organization? And how has it been around so long if it's not necessary? How did you let it get to this scale if it's not necessary?
Yeah. I mean, it's also, you think about how big these numbers can get. It's going to cost Intuit estimated between $250 and $260 million for this reorganization plan to happen. I mean, the severance pack. I always think about the severance packages. I'm like, all right, what are these people getting? Right? They're getting 16 weeks of pay plus 2 additional weeks for every year of service that they had, plus insurance coverage. And they had a 60-day notice prior to the termination. So their last day is September 9th. If I'm an employee at this company and I got until September 9th to just kind of kick it, and then at that point I get 16 weeks of pay, I'm like, I'm having a vacation for the whole rest of the year. And it's crazy how much it costs. So you really have to do a deep cost benefit analysis to be like, this reorganization is going to help us 4X down the line in the future. It's going to cost us a lot of money right now. But hopefully they've done some sort of benefit analysis that said, okay, you know, at least by the time we're finished with this reorganization, we should hopefully get to the point where we've made up for how much it costs us to do this.
Yeah. You know, I think what's interesting too is sometimes, like, you know, again, accounting is the language of business. That, what would you say, $250 million for this reorg?
Yeah, 250 to 260.
That's non-operating line item on your income statement. So essentially, like, it's this one-time expense they recognize and they pull it out of the operating. And so, you know, I think a lot of organizations look at that and it kind of like protects some of their KPI metrics that the street will look at, and it doesn't hit like the normal course of business. It's you know, considered like a one-time event almost. You know, disclosure or thing. And so it gets pulled out a lot of your metrics, and people say, oh, well, you know, it's this one thing. Don't look at it too closely. And so from a KPI perspective, I think what occurs is their KPIs still look really strong and good, despite the fact they just laid off, 1,800 people or 18,000, whatever it was, and a $250 million expense along with it. So you always got to think about what the accounting implications are around these things.
Absolutely. So with that, I want to get to wrapping things up with our final Make Me Lull segment real quick, just to tap on through it because we're all on the go here. We're making our moves. What's the hardest thing you ever got in trouble for? What's the weirdest thing you ever got in trouble for at work? I was accused of being disrespectful because the 6 people I CC'd on an email weren't listed in the order of seniority.
I can't wait to do this to somebody and just like as a
joke.
Be like, you do know I'm more senior than Tom, and so therefore I should have been higher in the copy list on this email, right? And just see the look of like terror on their face, just to be like, no one actually cares. Like, you know, I'm just messing with you. That is wild. That is absolutely crazy.
I think for me the 2 craziest were I had changed my LinkedIn job title. I added a role for my LinkedIn job title. It's a special projects coordinator, which I had specifically asked if I was like, oh, do you mind if I make my email signature that? Because I just like to be, I don't know, I wanted to be different. I don't want to audit associate. I was like, I want to I'm working on this innovation council stuff. Let me be able to have some fun with it. I got reamed out. Some partner who wasn't aware of the situation is he's telling the clients that he's working in marketing now, and that he's not going to be able to spend time on their engagement. And I was like, whoa, okay, now we're taking things out of context here. So I got in trouble for a job title. I was like, LinkedIn is not official, right? You could call your job title. I could call myself the CEO of the world on LinkedIn. Mm-hmm. That doesn't make me the CEO of the world,
Mr. Worldwide.
Yeah, and then I also had the reply all, where there was an email chain, and I just started replying all, and I kept the chain going, and I got in trouble for sending a meme in there. It was the 26th email of this chain that had accidentally been sent to company all.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of some crazy ones. I definitely know I've had some that when you get in trouble for it, you're just pissed the rest of the day because you're like, I can't believe that this was a problem or this was an issue. Or it's I think the ones that really upset me are just the hypocritical ones where it's oh, hey, they can do that, but you can't do that. Or I can do this, but you can't do this because of whatever silly reason it is, But essentially it is it's just politics and you're not part of the club or whatever it is. I'm trying to think of the craziest one I've ever had. And honestly, I'm kind of spacing.
Yeah, it is one of those power trip things, that is just... People get on these power trips and they want to show they feel some sense of importance, and I think everybody's out there trying to figure out how can I have a sense of importance, and I feel what I'm doing in my job is really worth it, and where I've gotten myself to in my career is worth it. We'll see how this gets crazy when it comes to the transparency stuff.
I'm gonna have to go look up the thread on this. I want to read the rest of them. I want to know what this came out with, because that is just crazy. And to your point, the power trips. I think what always annoys me the most isn't someone that necessarily is recognizing that they're on a power trip and they're just kind of a tyrant. Those people, it's they are kind of who they are and they know who they are. I think it's the ones that think they're legitimately justified in what they're saying. I'm sure the person that told her this were of course that is how you would do this. And it's like, that makes absolutely no sense. So I always love what you find for FTF, Drew. These are always fantastic.
Yeah. It's the internet never fails to
Never
amaze.
fails. Yeah.
So that brings us over to our concluding cycle. This was a great session. We were able to knock this out remotely here. I don't know if you have any fun stats or words of wisdom to depart us with as we conclude ourselves into the concluding cycle. Any final disclosures?
Final disclosures. No, I feel like the FASB's put enough disclosures on us. I think I'll just let this one ride out.
That's fair. But yeah, so checking in from Fort Worth, checking in from Salt Lake City. This has been FinTech Flo on the go. So if you want us to come to your city, I'm happy to get the chance to go on visit. And I want to give a little shout out to Whitley Penn. They let me hop into their office to do the podcast recording. Attended my session yesterday. Enjoyed talking about injecting content into accounting. So gave me a water. Very great Southern hospitality.
Southern hospitality, baby.
Yeah,
good.
always appreciate it. And checking out from the Lone Star State, I am Drew Carrick.
I'm Stefan Van Dyvendijk.
This was the FinTech Flo. We'll see everybody next week.
See you guys.
Thanks for checking out the FinTech Flo. As a reminder, this episode is available for CPE credit, and you can get that at FloAcademy or on the Earmark app. Details are in the description below.